They didn't call it infertility, they called it failure. In ancient Rome, a woman's purpose was not to love, lead, or learn, it was to produce heirs. If her womb stayed empty, she was treated as broken, cursed, or worse, useless. Behind the marble columns and gold-trimmed halls, the women who couldn't bear children were quietly punished, cast out, silenced, forgotten. This is not just the story of one woman, it's the buried history of what Rome did to those whose only crime was not bleeding at the right time or not bleeding at all. She had been married for 2 winters when the whispers began. They came from the kitchen girls first, in hushed tones over bread dough and olive oil, then from the neighbors, who peered too long at her belly when she walked through the atrium, and finally, from her husband's sister, who left a carved fertility figurine at the foot of her bed, wrapped in a cloth stained with goat's blood. Her name was Tullia, daughter of a merchant, wife of a senator, and her only task, the one thing she had been trained for since she was 12, was to give birth. Each month, when the blood came, she cried quietly into her sleeve and burned fresh lavender in the courtyard to mask her shame. Her mother told her to lie with figs under her tongue. The physician prescribed wine boiled with wormwood. The priest suggested she kneel before Juno's altar and confess her impure thoughts, but the cradle remained empty and the eyes around her sharper. In Rome, a man could cast off his wife for barrenness without apology, a whisper to the right magistrate, a payment to the temple, and the union was undone. But until then, she was kept not out of mercy, but duty. Her body was still young, her skin unmarked. There was still hope that one night would take. Each morning, she woke before the servants, drank cold water with ash, and prayed until her knees bruised. She was not alone. The city was full of women like her, women who bled too often or not at all, who drank bitter herbs in desperation or watched younger girls replace them. But they rarely spoke to one another. Rome taught them to keep their pain private, their wombs public. When her husband began eating alone, Tullia knew. When his cousin began visiting more often, she stopped lighting the oil lamps at dusk. And when the scroll came signed and sealed declaring the end of their union in the interest of legacy, she did not cry. She placed her hand on her stomach and whispered, "I am sorry." But Rome did not whisper back. It had already forgotten her. They did not test the men, they tested her. Tullia was made to strip beneath the full light of the household altar, where a hired midwife circled her body with oil-stained hands and murmured that her hips were too proud, her blood too cold. She pressed bitter poultices to Tullia's belly, burned dried bees over her thighs, and left her with warnings to abstain from olives, figs, and all thoughts of mourning. Every month, another ritual, another potion, another violation dressed as hope. Her mother brought a charm of dried wolf's tongue to tie around her neck. Her aunt whispered that the gods demanded silence, that conception only came to obedient mouths. Her husband stopped asking if she was well and began sending herbs in bowls she could not identify. One afternoon, a woman was brought in, a priestess, they said, from the countryside, known to speak to the spirits of unborn children. She poured wine onto the tiled floor, watched it trickle like veins across the stone, and told Tullia that her womb was turned away from heaven. That night, Tullia lay with her hips raised by bricks, knees bent like a dying deer, the air thick with incense and sweat. When she still did not quicken, the fault became her soul. They told her to fast, to walk barefoot on temple ground, to bathe in cold river water before sunrise. She bled through her tunics and kept quiet. She swallowed crushed pearls in vinegar. She slept with poppy seeds under her tongue, and still, no child. Behind her eyes grew a constant ache, the kind that comes from praying too long, from hearing one's worth measured in silence. The physician returned with a thin rod carved from ivory, meant to clear the passage. She bled for 2 days. No one asked if it hurt. The following week, her husband sent word that she would no longer join him at the public games. It was unseemly, he said, for a barren woman to sit beside a senator. Tullia stared at her reflection in the bronze mirror, wondering if her womb had somehow crawled up into her throat, sealing off her voice as well. She was still beautiful, but beauty was not currency anymore, not in a city where bloodline meant empire, not in a house where legacy mattered more than love. She pressed a hand to her belly, where no life stirred, and realized the truth no one dared say aloud, that a Roman woman was not a person, she was a promise. And a promise unfulfilled was not mourned, it was erased. Her name was Aelia Marcia, and the city once bowed to her smile. She was born into a noble family, married off before her first blood, and draped in pearls before she ever learned the weight of silence. Her husband, Lucius, was a rising senator, young, powerful, and eager to carve his name into marble before his 30th year, but marble demanded sons. After 4 years of offerings, prayers, physicians, and shameful nights spent beneath fertility statues, Aelia remained untouched by the gods. At first, Lucius brought her fig cakes and kissed her brow, whispering that love was enough. By the 6th year, he returned home less often. The servants began to open her letters before she did. Her robes were replaced with paler ones, a shade closer to mourning than matrimony. She stopped being asked to host feasts. The matrons around her smiled with their mouths and not their eyes, rubbing their pregnant bellies as if to remind her of the space she could not fill. Then came the girl, his cousin's daughter, Livia, barely 14, with eyes like new honey and hands that trembled whenever Lucius passed too close. She was brought in under the guise of companionship, but the staff began calling her Domina behind closed doors. Aelia pretended not to hear. The law required reason for a man to discard his wife, and Rome had many: madness, adultery, heresy. But the quiet truth was this: a woman who could not bear children was no wife at all. When the magistrate arrived with parchment in hand and a slave to witness, Lucius did not meet her eyes. He simply handed her a document that named her unfit for legacy. She was not accused. She was not cursed. She was simply declared irrelevant. They gave her 3 days to leave the house that bore her name. The pearls were taken back, the slaves assigned to her quarters reassigned, even her dogs refused to follow. When she stepped out of the atrium for the last time, she passed the young girl seated at her loom, already wearing the red ribbon of betrothal. No one stopped her. She walked until the marble gave way to dirt, until the sound of fountains was replaced by market cries. Aelia found shelter in her cousin's villa outside the city, where the walls did not whisper but did not comfort either. She lived out her days there, not mad, not broken, but invisible. Her name faded from the records within a generation. The man she once called husband became consul. His sons bore his name, and Aelia Marcia, once the most adorned woman in 3 provinces, became what Rome feared most: a woman who remembered, but was not remembered. Her name was Neria, though no one spoke it above a whisper. She was purchased at 12, inspected like livestock by a merchant who pried open her mouth and pressed 2 fingers into her hips to check if they would widen properly. She was sold as fertile stock to a household where the master had no sons, and the wife had already bled herself into madness from grief. Neria was not a girl. She was a solution. They dressed her in soft linen, scented her with oils, and fed her honeyed dates to sweeten her breath. Her new role was spoken plainly: she would be placed in the master's bed until she carried a child. No temple rites, no ceremony, just a quiet command and a locked door. Her first night was short and sore, the second, longer. By the third, she stopped crying. Months passed, no swelling. The midwife said her blood was slow. The mistress said she was cursed. The master said nothing. They doubled her rations, burned rosemary under her sheets, and made her sleep with iron under her pillow to ward off barrenness. Still, nothing. The house began to watch her. The older slaves avoided her shadow. The mistress stopped speaking altogether, her eyes hollow with something beyond rage, something like hunger. When Neria reached 14 and her belly remained flat, they sent her to the women's chamber in the cellar. There, an old woman smeared goat fat across her abdomen and muttered words in a language Neria didn't know. Then came the smoke, thick, stinging, and laced with something that made her limbs forget how to run. She woke sore, dizzy, and stained. When she asked what had happened, the other girls looked away. By the following moon, the master refused to look at her. The mistress had her linen garments stripped. The final shame came in silence. One morning, she was sent to the bathhouse alone. When she returned, her mat was gone. her name scratched off the sleeping chart. A small parcel of olives and bread waited by the door, along with a scroll bearing no seal. She was not sold again. That would have implied worth. Instead, she was released, but not free. No Roman would take a barren slave. They believed it was a mark of divine rejection. Neria wandered until she found shelter in the outskirts of the Subura, where other women with the same blank eyes and empty arms waited out the years in quiet trades, weaving, mending, sometimes begging. Her womb had betrayed her, they said, but she had never asked it to bear anything. She had only asked to survive, and somehow, even that had been too much. They said she was lucky, her husband was kind, her home large, her dowry generous. But luck in Rome was a fragile thing, and Fabricia learned quickly that kindness was only ever conditional. After 5 years of marriage and no child, the house began to hum with tension. She was still beautiful, still young, but her beauty no longer bought patience. Every month she marked her cycle with quiet dread, praying for the blood not to come, pressing warm cloths to her belly, whispering to the marble statues in the garden as if they could open her body from within. When even the gods ignored her, she turned to deception. At first, it was small. She wore thicker robes, stood at a tilt to soften her shape, feigned illness in the morning. Her husband seemed pleased. She spoke of imaginary cravings, whispered about dreams filled with laughter and chubby hands. The household rejoiced. The servants began preparing the nursery. Gifts arrived from relatives. Fabricia smiled through it all, each lie stitched tighter than the last. By the 3rd month, she knew the truth would consume her if she didn't feed it something, so she bought herbs to swell her belly, ate salt until her hands trembled, swaddled herself in linen to mimic fullness. Her husband beamed, her mother praised the gods, her womb remained silent. In the 7th month of her deception, a neighbor's wife lost her child at birth. Fabricia heard the cries, the priest's chant, and saw the bundle too still, too cold, carried through the alley behind the villa. That night, under cover of fog, she slipped out and stole the corpse. She wrapped it in silk, kissed its cold forehead, and brought it home in her arms. She wailed before dawn, said the baby had come too soon, had died in her sleep. Her husband held her as she shivered. The household mourned. The priests burned incense. And Rome, satisfied by the presence of grief, gave her silence. For a moment, she thought she was safe, but a servant girl had seen the alley, had seen Fabricia disappear with empty arms and return with full ones. The whispers began again, sharper than before. The husband grew distant. One morning, soldiers arrived not for her arrest, but for an investigation into spiritual fraud. Rome did not take kindly to those who mocked birth, who mimicked divine processes for favor or pity. She was not charged, not formally. But her husband dissolved the marriage, citing moral deviation. She was cast from the home with nothing but a shawl and a scar she could not show. The dead child was buried in sacred ground. She was not. In the end, Fabricia's crime was not theft. It was hope, a hope so desperate it dressed itself in death and dared to pass as love. Rome never forgave her for that. There was a place beyond the olive groves, where the hills curved inward like a cradle too deep to climb out of. They called it the Temple of Reconciliation, though no one who entered ever returned reconciled. It was where they sent the women who could not bear children, but whose husbands had influence enough to make their failure sacred rather than scandalous. They were not beaten, they were not exiled. They were offered to the gods in silence and buried alive inside marble walls. Portia had once stood at the center of every feast, her laugh echoing through colonnades, her beauty recited like scripture in the mouths of young men. But she had borne no children, and in her 6th year of marriage, her husband took her by the wrist during dinner, led her to the garden, and told her he had arranged her honorable departure. That was the phrase, not exile, not punishment, departure. She was dressed in white, her hair unbound, and placed on a litter carried by silent men who never made eye contact. No farewell, no protest. Women did not protest in Rome, especially not women without heirs. The temple sat within a hollowed hill, shrouded in cypress and guarded not by soldiers, but by law. No men were permitted inside, no letters left, no names carved. Portia was met by veiled figures who removed her jewelry, washed her body in frigid water, and clothed her in a simple wool shift the color of ash. She was not told the rules because there were none, only expectations. She would rise before the Sunday, she would eat only what was handed to her, she would speak only when commanded. The days bled into one another. The silence there was not peaceful, but suffocating, thick as wool, heavy as forgotten prayers. Some women aged quickly, their backs curving in grief. Others clung to rituals. One spun thread without pause. Another lined pebbles across her cell in patterns only she understood. Portia sat at the window slit, watching birds that never landed. On the 23rd day, she was called to the inner chamber. There, beneath a domed ceiling etched with constellations, she knelt. A priestess placed her hands on Portia's womb, whispered a benediction in a language older than Rome, and marked her forehead with ash. She was now reconciled, they said. No longer a wife, no longer a woman, only a vessel emptied of duty. She would stay there until her hair turned white and her body forgot the sound of touch. Outside, her husband remarried within the year. His new wife bore twins. Portia's name was never spoken again, but in the temple, her silence remained etched into stone, carried in the dust of every woman who came after. In the back rooms of Rome's narrow alleys, beneath painted gods and flickering oil lamps, the midwives kept their own secrets. They were the ones who knew which wives bled too early, which slaves never bled at all, and which girls came with trembling hands and coins wrapped in cloth, begging for herbs that could unmake a mistake. These women were neither priestesses nor physicians. They lived between law and survival, trusted and feared. Some had delivered senators' sons into silk cradles. Others had buried tiny limbs in gardens no one visited. And some, like old Vibia, remembered every barren womb she had tried to fix and every one she had failed to. Vibia had long fingers and eyes that did not blink often. She never asked names, only dates. She kept bundles of dried rue, black cohosh, and roots from beyond the walls, things Rome called illegal unless used for noble births. When a woman came to her, it was often too late. By then the stomach was flat, the blood irregular, and the marriage already thinning. Still, they came noble women veiled in dusk, slaves carrying bruises, young girls with hope leaking out of their eyes. One night, a girl was brought in by her cousin. She had been married for 2 years, but no child had taken. The husband blamed her. The family whispered about a curse. She had tried everything, baths in goat milk, chants to Venus, lying naked under moonlight. Nothing remained but Vibia. The old midwife examined her, silent. Then she lit a long, thin taper and began to mix herbs, not for healing but for forgetting. The girl drank, then she screamed. The concoction burned like fire in her womb, and when she passed out, Vibia whispered an apology only the gods would hear. She buried the cloths used to catch the blood under her floorboards. No one asked questions, but the next week a magistrate came with soldiers. The girl had died. Not that night, but 3 mornings later in her sleep, from what the physician called internal rot. Vibia was taken to the city square, where her hands were broken before a crowd. Not because she had killed. Rome had no law for that, but because she had interfered with divine fate. It was said she cursed the wombs of Rome. They left her to rot in a stone cell, but even there, women came, pressing hands to the wall, whispering through cracks, desperate for help. She never answered again. Her tongue had been cut. Years later, her cell was sealed, and no midwife dared take her place. But the blood-stained floor remained, and so did the buried cloths. Rome forgot Vibia's name, but in the dark corners of women's baths and whispering chambers, they still said her story, not as a warning but as a prayer. There was no trial, no sentence carved into stone, just the quiet vanishing of names from scrolls, the sudden absence of a woman at the market, an empty seat at a feast where her laughter once echoed. Rome did not bury its shame beneath monuments. It buried it in forgetting, and the womb, when it failed, became not just a personal sorrow but a social stain, one that families scrubbed clean with silence. In noble houses, portraits of childless wives were quietly removed, letters bearing their handwriting were burned. Jewelry passed down through maternal lines was melted and reforged for new brides, fertile ones. Even slaves who failed to bear children were sold under new names, their old ones struck from the records, as if language itself could erase the failure of flesh. In one villa, near the Palatine Hill, there once lived 3 sisters, all married, all barren. By the end of the decade, their names were never spoken aloud, and their husbands had each remarried within months of quiet annulments. One of the sisters, Lucilla, had written poetry that was once recited in salons. Her verses, delicate and fierce, filled with longing and dust, vanished alongside her, not banned, simply no longer copied, not destroyed, merely ignored. And in Rome, ignorance was more final than fire. Across the empire, temples built in honor of fertility, gods kept ledgers, names of women who had conceived after offering tribute. Those who returned barren were not marked. Their offerings, their prayers, their sacrifices, all were absorbed into stone and forgotten. In the state's eyes, a woman's body was a transaction. If it failed to deliver, the contract dissolved. No legacy, no name, no place. The tombs of great men were built with columns and flame. The tombs of these women were unmarked, or not built at all. Some were buried in common graves, their histories swallowed by weeds and stray dogs. Others, if lucky, were mourned by a servant, a sibling, or a daughter they raised but never bore. The rest simply vanished. What Rome did to women who could not bear children was not always violent. It did not always bleed, but it was cruel in the quietest way by making them disappear. Not just from their homes, their beds, their roles as wives or mistresses, but from memory itself. Their names were not cursed, they were erased. And if you wander the ruins today, among broken marble and half-crumbled statues, you will not find their names etched in stone. But listen. Beneath the cracks, in the cold breath between columns, something still lingers, the echo of women who were meant to be forgotten, but never truly went silent. If these stories haunt you the way they haunted history, remember, silence was the punishment, but memory is the rebellion. Subscribe to Forgotten Stories, Ancient World for more hidden truths, erased voices, and the women Rome tried to forget.